Hey, welcome back to Transform Your Workplace. I'm your host, Brandon Laws, and I've got an exciting conversation today with Sabina Nawaz, the author of the incredible new book, You're the Boss, Become the Manager You Want to Be and Others Need. In this conversation, Sabina shares her personal journey from being an exceptional, caring manager who was rising rapidly through the ranks at Microsoft to suddenly finding herself overwhelmed by pressure and inadvertently becoming what she calls the boss from hell. Sabina and I dive deep in the conversation into the hidden blind spots and myths that leaders often face, why pressure, not power, is the real culprit behind poor leadership, and how small intentional habits can completely transform the way you lead your team. This episode is packed with insights, relatable stories, and practical tools you can apply right away to become the manager your team truly needs. But before we dive in, I want to remind you that today's episode is brought to you by Xenium HR. And if you're ready to level up your team's leadership capabilities, go check out Xenium's leadership and development programs. They feature leadership cohorts, on-demand courses, micro-learning sessions, and monthly virtual workshops designed to elevate your people. You can find them at xeniumhr.com. And don't forget, if you enjoyed this episode, share it with a colleague and friends, hit that subscribe button, and we'd love it if you'd take a moment to rate and review the podcast. It helps us grow and continue to deliver great content for leaders just like you. All right, now let's jump into my conversation with Sabina Nawaz. Sabina, it is such a pleasure to have you on Transform Your Workplace. Thanks for coming on the show.
Thank you, Brandon. I'm looking for some inspiration from you on how I can transform my workplace after talking with you.
I'm going to do my best, but this is all about you. You've got a new book out. It's called You're the Boss, Become the Manager You Want to Be and Others Need. I was telling you before we started recording, I wish I had this when I was in my early 20s, becoming a new manager. It's well thought out and well researched, but it's also very personal, and you share a lot of great stories. So I can't wait to get into this with you. You start in the introduction by talking about how you would become the boss from hell. And it's great because you outline how you were increasing your competency, your skills, you were getting promotion after promotion. And because people were saying you were such a great and caring boss, but at some point you just maybe under the pressure, but you went from caring and supportive, in your words, to somebody who was abrupt and dismissive without even really realizing it, probably until you got feedback. Like, to walk me through that and what that moment, the aha moment for you was.
Well, I think it all started with pressure. And as you know, I say in the book that it's not power, but pressure that corrupts. And I was under so much pressure with a newborn baby at home, doing projects directly for the CEO of Microsoft and in very high pressure, high visibility scenarios. And I thought, yeah, right now I've just got to hunker down. Just got to get this done. There'll be time for empathy later. There'll be time for connection later, except there's never a later, because when does the pressure ever get released? And I was a great boss before I had all these pressures around, but then that same person can change in a different way. I didn't realize, I thought I was being very efficient. Look at this, we're hitting all this out of the ballpark. We're not making any errors that make us look embarrassing to our senior executives. Things are going great, right? And of course, nobody around me was telling me that it wasn't, because power and that difference in hierarchical structure also causes a silencing of the people, especially when you're not on your best behavior, which I certainly wasn't.
When you were rising through the ranks and people were saying you were a great boss, what were some of the things that they would say about you? What made you so special?
Yeah, well, I don't know that I'm that special, but for them, they felt that I really cared. And because I asked them when they would say, oh, you're a great boss, or you're the best boss I've had, and so on. And I thought, well, what is it that I'm doing that makes you say that? And they say, you really care. And I did really care. I had detailed career development plans for people. I cared about their work-life balance. Not that it was always perfect, but whatever I could do to support them. I cared about giving them feedback. I gave them a lot of positive feedback. There were a ton of things. I loved managing people. And so I invested a lot of time in it.
When you started feeling the pressure, where were you at in your life? I think you said you had a newborn baby. I know the home life can definitely impact work, but I'm sure for you, because I think you were at Microsoft at the time, when did you feel like the pressure became so much for you where it actually did impact your level of caring as a boss?
Yeah, so it was right before I went on to have my first baby. My boss called me one day, just shortly before, and said, I'm leaving. You're taking my job. I said, yeah, sure. I'll think about it when I come back from leave. She's like, no, this is tomorrow. And so here I was doing 2 jobs. And so as soon as I came back from leave, I was in this newly promoted position, which was really visible to the topmost ranks at Microsoft, have the newborn baby. The very first day I'm coming back from parental leave, my assistant calls me before I've left home. Where are you? And there's this edge of anxiety in her voice. And I'm like, what? And she's like, Steve expects you in 30 minutes. Steve
Ballmer.
Steve Ballmer. And so she's reading me the memo as I'm driving to work. And that's what set the tone and the pace for the rest of my days in that job. So it was very fast paced. It was fast moving. I'm needing to respond to executive requests frequently. All of that got to a point.
You mentioned that new leaders, and this is true for you as well in this role you're talking about, but you often will cling to things that made you successful before, even when it may no longer serve you in this new role. Like, what common blind spots do you see leaders making when they transition into a new role and those old skills don't really serve them anymore?
Yeah, and this is true for any level of management, all the way to CEO, is every time we get promoted, something that worked here is going to look very different to the next that are craning up to look at you. You have all the noble intentions and good intentions. You don't wake up saying, oh, let me be the source of misery for my people. Yet whenever we talk to people about bosses, whenever people hear I'm writing a book about bosses, they're like, oh yeah, I've had one of those bosses, right? And it's not that all of those bosses are people who take joy in meting out misery to people. So what happens? What happens is that those strengths can get viewed very differently from the other side of the power gap, if you will. In my case, efficiency and getting a lot done quickly was a strength of mine. But the way it showed up when I was under high pressure, I'm not explaining things as well. I'm not taking time to connect with people. So it's showing up as kind of uncaring. There are some other really common blind spots that show up. So if somebody is very detail oriented, you can guess that's going to show up as micromanagement. When somebody is very calm, that can show up as this person lacks passion, or they don't care, or they're aloof. So there's nothing wrong with these traits, but they get seen in a whole different way. You didn't change, your circumstances changed, your perch changed.
You outline 4 pervasive boss myths in the book. Which one do you see as the most dangerous for leaders, and how can they unlearn that myth?
I'd say the first one to start with is the yeah, but. And often people say, yeah, but. Because they don't think of themselves as that boss. They don't think of themselves as agents of misery. So they go, yeah, but we're under a tight deadline. Yeah, but this is the busiest time of year. Yeah, but. And so I think that would be the first thing to examine is your language. If you're yeah-butting your way through your day, likely that's showing up in a very different way to the people who work for you and with you. The improv practice of yes and is a great way to convert that. So from the yeah, but, can you go to a yes and?
Yeah, I love that. I've heard that many times. It's hard to put into practice sometimes, but it is so effective because you're collaborating, you're building on the other person's ideas versus the yeah, but. It's very dismissive. And I mean, imagine having employees who are like, well, I'm not being heard. So what does that make them feel like?
Exactly, Brandon. So for example, yeah, but this is the busiest time of the year. And if I give you the clarity you're looking for, despite my busyness, you will get your job done faster with fewer errors. So it'll make me less busy.
Right. You talk about power in the book, and you describe this leader, Adam, who was shocked to learn how his team actually perceived him once he got into a position of power. Why do you think so many leaders become aware of their impact once they have that power? And how can we make sure that we don't fall into this trap? Because the power feels good. Like once you keep elevating, it's like, wow, look at me. I'm on top of the world and I'm in a position of power now. I got to probably act a certain way. So they're playing the part, but blind spots, I'm sure, come with that.
Blind spots come with that because also the people around us cushion us from the tough news. Because who's going to say, hey, boss, you suck at that, when that boss determines my future, my paycheck, my promotion, my bonus? And so we don't hear the feedback that we need. And simply asking our people and telling them, hey, give me feedback, they're going to nod, they're going to say yes, but they're going to cushion that feedback with a lot of sweetness. And then you don't know until it's too late. So your question of what can we do ahead of time? I think one of the things is to look at yourself in the mirror and be brutally honest. A tell would be whenever you're doing a yeah, but chances are you realize it's not the right thing to do and you should be changing it, shifting it. And you can ask yourself a few questions. The book at the very end has something called 360 Yourself. It's a set of 42 questions that will show you exactly where your blind spots are. And if you don't have the time to do those 42 questions, here are 4 questions you can ask yourself. Do you use yeah, but very often? Do people ever push back or give alternate ideas to yours? Are you the only one or the one who most often works the hardest, stays there the longest, comes up with all the ideas, sets the agenda? So those are a lot of different ways in which you can diagnose, I might be in trouble territory. Because, of course, again, I'm in a hurry, I'm under pressure, I hear silence, I think it's agreement. There might be a totally different story going on here.
You outlined the power gap distortion very well in the book. I think you alluded to it a little bit earlier when you were giving some examples of this versus that, but like, can you give some examples of how this power gap distortion shows up in maybe a couple of examples?
Absolutely. Absolutely. There are 3 different power gap distortions, and I'll give you the example through one of the power gaps, which is very common, called the singular story. And the singular story is, I have a point of view. I have an idea, or I have an interpretation or a direction I want to go in. And that direction becomes the direction because nobody else is telling me their ideas. Because they're afraid to disagree with me, or if I'm the first one who puts that forth, then who's going to argue with that? Well, yeah, boss, you're right. Let's go in that direction. And then we make wrong moves. And this happened with somebody where he made a big strategic bet on a particular piece of technology. And no one said anything. 18 months into the project, they realized that this was the wrong bet. The reality is, because I had interviewed people later, people knew ahead of time that it wasn't going to work, but they perceived this person as so single-tracked and so confident about this is the way to go, they didn't want to argue. Also, when they argued, they would get a lot of yeah buts, so they gave up.
You start chapter 4, which you talk about pressure, with this quote from Abraham Lincoln, which I love. You said, "Nearly all men can stand adversity, but if you want to test a man's character, give him power," end quote. So you challenge this idea that power corrupts, arguing that it's the pressure that causes people to behave poorly. Maybe share an example how leaders can manage that pressure before it starts distorting their decision making. Because I know, like, and I'm sure this happened to you, pressure starts and then you start making decisions you otherwise wouldn't have if you didn't have that pressure on you.
Exactly. So you're talking about how to manage that pressure. And here's the thing, success isn't about being pressure free. It's about being pressure proof. You're never going to get rid of pressure. In fact, there's more and more getting added in our world on a daily, hourly basis. It's how do you deal with that pressure? What are some concrete ways in which you tackle that? To your point, Brandon, what are some ways you might address them, head them off at the pass in some cases? One of the things you can do is called a time portfolio, which is similar to, let's say, if you were managing your money and you might say, I want to set aside this much money to just play around with, this much money to be surefire investment that I don't touch, this much doing this level of risk or whatever. Well, if we say time is our most precious resource, Why don't we have a time portfolio? When I work with my clients on a time portfolio, it has 3 steps. Step number 1, identify the chunks, big chunks of space where you dedicate time. So it could be email, messaging, communications is one chunk. It could be managing my people, doing the performance reviews, running the staff meetings, whatever. It could be the boss tax, where I have to attend my manager's team meetings, report ups, reviews, and so on. Maybe I do some work on some products or design or some deliverables. Maybe also I work with the outside world and conferences and so on. So I come up with somewhere between 5 to 10 chunks that go into my portfolio. And I do a rough estimate of what percentage of time do I spend on each of those buckets. That's my current snapshot. Looking at that, most people say, oh, I got to spend a lot less time on email and messaging, of course, because they're spending, let's say someone's spending 40% of their time on that. And they go, oh my gosh, I've got to get that to 15%. So mistake number 1 is to try and go from 40 to 15 overnight. So step number 2 is to set that long-term goal. Okay, I want to go from 40 to 15. And with that extra time that's freed up, I'm going to invest more in these other buckets in my portfolio. Step number 3 is create an intermediate column, which you're going to do in the next several months. So if you're at 40% today, that intermediate percentage would be 35. And you identify an action item that will help you with that. For example, that person might get rid of pop-up notifications, or for the first 20 minutes of every day when they start working, they don't get online. They think their big thoughts and work on the big pieces, whatever it might be. So some small action item. This time portfolio has transformative power. It anticipates, you're being honest about where you're going to spend your time. So it anticipates how to make that shift, but do it in a gentle way versus this abrupt thing that's never going to succeed. You're never going to go from 40 to 15 overnight. It's sort of like when you're driving in a road and you see a big curve up ahead. It's not like you're swerving your steering wheel over and over again, right? You just notice that, and then you make thousands of little adjustments, so it's almost automatic by the time you get to the curve. It's the same with time portfolio.
In part 2 of the book, it's becoming the boss of you. You introduce some foundational tools like cost benefit analysis and micro habits. I like the micro habits idea. Like, what are some of the most simple, effective micro habits that a leader could easily put to practice today to become a better boss to their people?
Yes. So first thing is listening. You could have a micro habit that says, I'm going to paraphrase somebody one time a day in one meeting. A micro habit has 2 characteristics. It's ridiculously small, and you do it every day. So what's something you can do every day? So that's a great one around listening that can help. Another could be around being fully present. So I might have a micro habit, again, during one meeting a day, I'm going to set aside my phone outside of arm's reach, or even during the first 5 minutes of a meeting, if that's too hard for you to be detached from your device for the whole meeting. So those are around presence, around listening. It could be around not interrupting. So how do I ask a question of curiosity as opposed to interrupt in the middle of what somebody is saying? It could be making sure my own communication is clear enough. So can I ask somebody else to play back what they thought I said so I can make sure my communication was clear?
What I love about the micro habits is that, for one, they're probably easy to implement, but 2, like if you do it enough, it becomes a habit. And sometimes those little things, in my opinion, are the difference makers. Like the margins are really what makes probably good leaders and bad leaders, wouldn't you think?
Absolutely, because how you do anything is how you do everything, as somebody wise once said. So people are watching all of your moves, and all of your moves are on display through a megaphone under a microscope. So every little twitch of your eyebrow is being read and interpreted 5 different ways if there are 5 different people in that room. All those things in the margins matter. And sometimes they matter a lot more than what you're saying, because it's what you're doing. And people are looking at the signs and going, no, that's not right.
I think one of the hardest jobs of leaders is communication. And some people get it right. A lot of leaders get it wrong. You identify communication fault lines in the book, and maybe just give some of the ideas of like what are the biggest communication breakdowns leaders make, and how can we become more aware of it and hopefully fix that approach.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, as you know, Brandon, from having read the book, and thank you for reading the book, that there are 7 different communication fault lines. It is the longest chapter of the book because it is so vitally important in so many different ways. And I could go on and on about it, but let me pick one. And that would be unspoken messaging. We all know that our nonverbals communicate a whole bunch of stuff, but do we make it explicit? So, first of all, rearrange your face before you go into a conversation. I have a very serious frowny face when I'm just thinking. It is nothing wrong. And I walk into a room and people go, "What's wrong? Are you okay?" Just thinking. So if frowning is your thinking face, be explicit about it. And there's a tool in the book called mapping, where you can give people a map of you. Here are my physical characteristics that translate like this. The frowning is the thinking face. Or maybe it has to do with my energy levels and timing, like a client of mine who was not sentient before 10 in the morning. So don't have meetings with me before 10 in the morning. Or it could be your email or text preferences, shorter messages, or put it all in one thing, or how do you like to communicate? So there's all these different things that you can give people a map for, so they're not guessing. And they're not wondering what happens as a result when you start to frown.
I've never worked inside of a large organization like Microsoft. I've worked in small business my whole life. And I know, and this is true, where you're really good at your job as a contributor. And then the next step is usually a leader position, a manager position. That's just the next progression. Is it like that at the large companies that you've seen? And does that mean they're going to automatically become a great leader? Because it doesn't seem like organizations do a really good job of preparing people for that next step. So I'm just curious what your take is on that.
Yeah. Brandon, we go to school and get trained for years on our profession. We then take additional classes and certifications and what have you. And then around management, we get promoted one day. Congratulations, you're a manager. And sometimes the best widget maker is not the best manager, and nor should they be. In large corporations, at least in my experience, there are often 2 career paths. So you can become a manager and get promoted up the management chain, but there should also be an individual contributor path, and you can get pretty senior in large companies on the individual contributor path. There are fewer people on that path, usually. There's a lot more people on the management side, just because of law of numbers too, of we need managers, and there's only so many people one person can manage.
Do you have any advice for people who struggle with that shift from individual contributor to leader, and what they should be focused on in terms of their development?
The first thing I think they need to think about is that it's not about you anymore, as in, it's not about your work. You have to create an environment for other people to do their work. So what are you doing to create the container instead of the content? You are no longer the content maker. You're the container holder and shaper. So what does that look like in actual work? It might be setting really clear goals and directions and vision. It might be setting expectations and holding people accountable to it. It might be giving feedback, both positive and corrective, very, very clearly, so people know what to keep doing more of or less of. So those are the kinds of things that you need to do. And the sooner you can get your hand out of the content pie, the sooner you can be successful as a manager.
I think one of the hardest jobs as a leader is making sure that we're taking care of ourselves. Because if we can't take care of ourselves, we're not going to take care of our people effectively. And you share a personal story. You were overloaded with work, personal responsibilities. I think like you were a sole earner at the time, taking care of your mother who is steadily advancing from Alzheimer's. I'm sorry, I've got family members that have gone through that. It's very difficult. How can you identify those hidden triggers that you call in the book before they fully escalate into stress reactions? Because there is physical reactions that happen when we just don't deal with the stressors that we have. So are there ways to mitigate some of these reactions?
Yes. And that certainly happened to me, and I had to pay a steep physical cost. Often I would watch for terms that you use and that you take pride in, like taking pride in being busy, taking pride in I can power through anything, taking pride in I can multitask. So there are some of these tells that will tell you that perhaps you're pushing things too much. I have a client who's really, really high bandwidth, very, very smart. He can take on just about anything, and he really can power through a whole bunch of stuff. And he was pushing his limits a lot for a couple of months. And then I get a text one evening, oh my gosh, I'm nearly having a panic attack. I'm like, okay, what's going on? Well, I have to speak on this podcast, and I haven't, and this is a big platform podcast. I haven't done a podcast before. I'm going to look really stupid. I don't know what I'm doing. I haven't had time to prepare for it. And just the week before, I had said, are you taking care of yourself? Oh, I'm fine. I can take care of all this stuff. Let's bring it on. I'm good. Of course, we helped talk him off the ledge and get him through the podcast, which of course went really well because this person is smart and knows a lot. But after that, the conversation we had was, would you have had such an extreme reaction had you taken better care of yourself? Think about the days when we've had a really good night's sleep and when we haven't. It shows in our cells, in our bodies. It shows in how other people see us. Ultimately, this person realized that, yes, they were still focused. They were getting a bunch of stuff done. But here, something like a podcast, which I knew he could hit out of the ballpark, just undoes him.
Many leaders fall into the trap of feeling like they have to have all the answers. I know there's been times where I felt like that too, but how can we effectively delegate without feeling like we're losing control or that we're not important?
The biggest mistake we make in delegation is treating it like a switch, an on-off switch. That, okay, Brandon, I'm going to delegate this to you. You're now empowered. Go make it happen. Do I have any idea if Brandon has ever done this piece before? Does he have skills in this? Does he have context? Does he have knowledge? So if he doesn't, if the answer to some of those questions is a no, what happens? You bring that back to me, let's say a day before the deadline. It's not what I was expecting, quality-wise, production-wise, whatever. And there goes my weekend, because now I have to swoop in. It's the opposite of empowerment. So now you feel completely disempowered, and why should I bother? She's going to redo everything anyhow. I feel totally frustrated. And the end result is probably not as good as it could have been if we had had more time. So instead of treating delegation as an on-off switch, treat it like a dial. Find out where this person is on that particular topic, that particular skill set, and turn that dial slowly so you're involved. Don't take your hand off the wheel until you're fully confident they've got this. So the dial has 5 steps. Just do the work first and have them watch maybe. Then you tell them explicitly what you might be doing or what they need to do. Be prescriptive if they're very early on in that particular area. Then you teach them. Then you coach them, and only then do you switch off.
One of the most profound chapters I found personally, and maybe just I needed it at the time, was the chapter 10, Root Out Unmet Hungers. And the unmet hungers, you're saying, like, plays a huge role in decision making, because it's like our beliefs and hungers, and that's how we're kind of viewing every decision making. There's a lot of stories we tell ourselves through our own lens. How do we use those unmet hungers and the examples you give in the book? How do we use those to prevent these subconscious drivers from influencing our leadership style in a certain way?
Let me set a little context for the listeners that unmet hungers are things that we have a deeply felt human need for. They often get set fairly early in life, and they could be our need for a lot of praise, a need for a lot of reassurance, a need to be seen as the martyr or the hero or the smartest person in the room. And so then how we act shows up based on those hungers unbeknownst to us. And then every action has a reaction, and that reaction is not that favorable. So your question was, Brandon, how do we set ourselves up to not just have the unmet hungers run the show? Just like when we go to the grocery store hungry and we pick up junk food, and the unmet hungers run the show, we're indulging in junky management behavior. So one is to first just really understand, what are your unmet hungers? All of us have it. All of us have it. No one is immune to it. And the book has a hunger tracker that you can look at to identify where is yours. And it's usually more than one thing. So let's say somebody's unmet hunger is to prove that they're superior to everybody else in the room. And therefore, they interrupt other people. They're the first one to speak. They jump in with a lot of ideas. They maybe take up more than their fair share of bandwidth and oxygen in the room. So they could use, for example, something called the shut up muscle, which is where they're not the first to speak. They're not the second to speak. They're at least the third, if not later, to speak. They might give themselves the task of never going to a meeting with a first draft, especially if they're a manager, because then who's going to disagree with that? And instead, have a brainstorming meeting where they collect ideas from everyone else and only add the things that others haven't added. So that's just one example.
Yeah, I love that. Well, let's end the conversation with where we started. I'm going to start with a quote here, though. The quote says, "You become blind to your management missteps because no one is willing to tell you what they really think," end quote. So you emphasize the importance of gathering honest feedback. I know that probably was transformative to your leadership when you went from a great boss and somebody who was caring to somebody who maybe was not so caring. But what's the best way for leaders to ensure that they're getting real, unfiltered input from their teams?
From their teams, it's very difficult. I am not sure that you're going to ever get 100% of the truth, but you can get a lot closer. One of the executives I worked with, in his team meetings, he has a round robin at the end in the last few minutes. And the question always is the same, which is, what is the last 10% you are not sharing? And now I imagine the first time he asked that, he got crickets. Who's going to step up and say anything? But because he did it consistently over and over again, year after year, do we ever drain the full 10% of that cup? No, and nor do we need to. But if that 10% went to 5%, it would make a huge difference.
Sabina, your book is great. It's called You're the Boss, Become the Manager You Want to Be and Others Need. What do you want to share in parting, or what do you want to point people to as we close out the conversation?
The one parting thought I'll say is that every action has a reaction. Do you know the reaction to your actions, and how are you going to find out? People can buy my book anywhere books are sold. I love to hear from folks. You can do that by going through my website, sabinanawaz.com, which I'm sure will be in the show notes. Feel free to follow me on LinkedIn, Instagram, Blue Sky, all of those social handles.
My guest today has been Sabina Nawaz, the author of You're the Boss. Thank you for being part of the show.
Thank you, Brandon.
Hey, thanks so much for tuning in for today's episode of Transform Your Workplace. The content on this show is strictly for general information and educational purposes only, so that you can go transform your workplace in a positive way. The views, thoughts, and opinions expressed on the show are the guest's own and don't represent the views, thoughts, and opinions of either Xenium HR, the sponsor of the show, or me, the host, Brandon Laws. Additionally, Xenium HR or myself, Brandon Laws, doesn't endorse any guest, their business, or any organization they represent, so discretion is advised. We encourage you to work with a trusted advisor to find a custom approach that fits your organization's needs. Thanks for tuning in to today's episode.